Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. This week we're actually up to week 6 of Portrait Artist of the Week, the Sky show which they've transferred from Sky TV over to Facebook Live to take account of the current pandemic situation. And this week we're going to be painting Noel Fielding. Now if you've been following these videos along each week, you'll know that each week I'm trying to show you a different technique. And I thought I would be a little bit inspired by what I did last time with Will Young, but with, a little bit of a different twist. So I'm keeping my materials simple like before. And I'm also starting with brown, but this time instead of using a Sharpie pen, I'm using a watercolor marker pen, using a burnt umber watercolor marker pen. And I'm going to modify the marks I put down in a different way to what I've done before in previous videos, and I'll come to that in a little bit. So these markers are by Winsor Newton. They're double-ended, so they've got a brush tip and a fine line tip. I'm using the fine line tip here, and I'm starting with a fairly careful drawing. So in previous videos I've sometimes used preliminary sketches. I did many of those for Will Young. I did several for Rankin, I did several for Bernardine Evaristo, but then for other people, just going straight in. So if you remember with Rob Rinder, no prelim sketches at all, and that's what I'm doing for Noel here. And I'm just working really quite carefully to make sure I get the proportions of the face correct. But the beauty of using the watercolor marker pen is that we can move it around a little bit on the paper and soften lines if we need to, using a clean wet brush, and that's one of the techniques I'm going to be using later on today. Now I should qualify that statement by saying that although this is watercolor, if you want to be able to soften the marks you put down and you want to be able to move the lines around a little bit, then it does depend on the paper you use. So I'm using quite high quality mixed media paper. I mean, it's fairly affordable, but it's a good quality drawing and painting paper. I'm using the mixed media paper by Daler-Rowney, but there are others on the market. Claire Fontaine does one, and I'm sure there are others. But if you were to try and do this on, say, just cheap paper that you would put into a photocopier, then you'd have less success, at least in my experience. So at the moment things are looking quite, almost cartoonish, I would say, for my drawing. But that's going to change as things go on. So you can see the watercolor marker, even with the fine line, it tends to put down, I'm not saying there's no leeway at all, but it tends to put down a single quality of line because it is a marker pen. It's difficult to get much variation in the thickness of the line or the quality of the mark you make using the fine line nib. But you can see that what I'm doing is, having studied the shape of both eyes carefully, the nose and the mouth, I'm now putting in little key indications of key features. So there's that little triangle of reflected light on the cheek, on Noel's right-hand cheek as we're looking at it. So I've included that. A little bit of a line at the bottom of the left-hand cheek as we're looking at it as well. And now moving on to this headband that Noel's wearing. And then, having begun to indicate that, I just want to capture the outline of his hair. So when we're painting hair, it's always best to just ignore the fact that it is hair, at least initially, and just look at it as a lump of stuff which has a particular shape. And then we can worry about light and dark and colour a little bit later on. But it's been great fun for me actually doing these portraits each week. One of the other projects that I've been doing for some time now on the channel is something called the Animal Alphabet Challenge. And I started off doing that with just using a Sharpie pen to do black and white sketches. And then that developed into doing a Sharpie sketch followed by vibrant watercolour washes. And that's kind of led me to rethink some of the ways I paint when it comes to my more elaborate paintings, you know, perhaps if I'm doing a landscape or an animal painting, you know, and spending several hours on it, because the Animal Alphabet Challenge is just quick experiments, basically. And although I've spent longer on doing pretty much all of these portraits than I would for one of the challenge pictures, because I'm using a different technique each week, it's really encouraging me to further explore different styles of portrait painting as well. And I think those are going to feed into some of the other work I do, some of the things I'm trying out here. So it's been a really wonderful thing that they're doing, Sky. I think, you know, the fact that anybody can tune in worldwide for free, yeah, absolutely fantastic. And I think I was listening to one of the shows and they were saying they had something like 2,200 portraits submitted of Noel. And I imagine, you know, across the globe there are many, many more people who are watching the show and just either not drawing or painting, just enjoying the show, or drawing and painting but not worrying too much about submitting. So yeah, it's been really fantastic. I was also pleasantly surprised this week that when I put up the my finished painting of Noel on my Instagram feed, Kate Bryan, one of the 3 judgmentals from the show, she gave me a gold star. So that was a nice little bright moment of the week there. Anyway, you can see that I've finished now putting in the outlines, in inverted commas, of Noel's portrait. So it's really, you know, it's just a simple illustration at the moment. But now I've come in with my 1/4 inch wide synthetic flat brush. And I've simply dipped that in some clean water, and you can see that that's allowing me to move those lines around and tease out some of this burnt umber pigment from the lines, and you get this lovely soft controllable wash. So it's a really nice and efficient way to work. Now, I have used this technique before, but never for a portrait. So one of the paintings I did, I think it's on the channel actually, I did a group of 5 cattle, and I outlined each of the animals in it with a different colour, and then I used this technique to create a sense of form. I'll pop that up on screen for you so you can check that out. And if I remember, I'll put the link to that video in the description as well. But what I'm doing, as you can see, I've just basically blocked in the mass of Noel's hair with basically a good solid mid-tone, because he's got very dark hair. And now I'm using some curved brush strokes over his headband to create a sense of light and dark and a sense of curvature, really. So keeping things really loose, so having been very precise with the line work, I can now, you know, move around a little bit more quickly and just introduce some mid-tone here and there as I see fit. And I don't need to worry about being too precise, because the watercolour is very forgiving. If I want to go over it again in certain areas with, you know, some darker colour or tone, then I'm going to be able to cover up what I'm doing here. And if I wanted to lift off some of this pigment as well, I probably could get most. I'm not saying you could get it back to the white paper, you know, pure white paper, but you'd be able to lift off a good amount, either with a wet brush or a wet paper towel. So watercolour is very forgiving, I think, particularly when you apply it in this way, because you set out a nice framework for yourself with the marker pen drawing, and now we're just kind of massaging the edges a little bit and kind of filling in areas. And, you know, it's still reasonably quick. It's perhaps not as quick as just dunking your brush in a big pool of watercolour and putting on a huge wash. But you can see that, you know, I filled this in here in just a few minutes. And already a sense of form is starting to appear. So in terms of colour, what I want to do today, you know, many of the portraits I've done for the Portrait Artist of the Week videos I've been publishing, they've been really quite vibrantly coloured. Some have been, you know, still somewhat realistic. So Akram and Bernardine's were pretty realistic, for example. When I went to Rankin, I kind of distorted the colours a little bit more. And then last week was a little bit exceptional because I did monochrome only for Will. And what I want to do here is go somewhere in between the two. So I'm starting off with this monochrome, this burnt umber, but I am going to add some accents of just 2 more colours, and you'll see that later on. But for now, having kind of blended and softened much of what I did with my initial drawing, I've now let that watercolour dry, having moved it around with the brush. And that doesn't take very long, because when all of the water's kind of contained in the brush, it's not like a normal wash where you kind of almost flood the water with a thin layer of, flood the paper with a thin layer of water. That can sometimes take quite a while to dry. But this dries really quite quickly. So yeah, just left it for a minute or two to dry, and now I'm coming back in again with the same burnt umber marker, and I can work over some of these areas to refine the shape of Noel's face, and also, deepen again the colour of the hair. And if I want to, I can leave some of that underlying wash exposed, as I am now, and that will act as a subdued highlight in the hair. So because Noel has very dark black hair, the highlights on his hair, they will be there, but they'll be far more subdued than perhaps the highlight in a reflective surface like the eye. So we definitely want to include highlights on dark things like the hair, but you definitely don't want to overcook it, because it just looks wrong. Now, in terms of the top he's wearing, again, it's a dark top with some broken hearts on it, and I'm not worrying too much about placing those hearts in exactly the right spot, but I just want to include them a little bit to indicate that this was the top that he was wearing. And I'm continuing with the marker, and you can see that the lines I've used on the right hand side of his top there, they're kind of, for the most part, vertical, and that's because the folds in the fabric, they are more or less in the vertical direction. So I don't know at this stage whether I will obliterate those marks or leave them entirely, but it just helps to keep your mark making in line with the way the cloth and the clothes are falling. But back to the face for the moment. Just darkened one of the eyebrows, and now I'm working on the eye in a little bit more detail. Again, just darkening some key shadows around the eye, and making some adjustments to the nose as well. So you can see I had the nose I felt too far over to our left. So I'm just moving that right hand nostril over to the right and adjusting the position of the tip of the nose, and just looking really carefully and not trusting my initial drawing. I wouldn't say at all. Hopefully I've got it in the right ballpark, but if it's wrong, it's wrong. So therefore, you'll just correct as you go. And when we're doing portraits, the angle of an eyebrow, just the slightest change can really affect the expression. You can change it from a person looking quite quizzical to looking really quite severe if you get the angle slightly wrong. And the same with where we put the pupil in the eye. That can change the look in somebody's eyes, really quite dramatically. So that's why I'm taking particular care in these areas. Now, things like a headscarf or a headband, as Noel is wearing today, that can be an advantage and a disadvantage, I think. But to look at the advantages, one of the main things that it really allows you to do is to create a sense of roundness in 3 dimensions quite easily. So, for example, if you're drawing somebody's hands and they happen to be wearing rings, or they've got a wristwatch on, by looking very carefully at the line of the wristwatch strap and making sure you get that right, and equally the line of the ring around the finger, or in this case the headband around the head, if you get that right, it's really going to help make the image convincing as a 3-dimensional object, because it's effectively a nice big contour line around the shape. Now you can see I've just adjusted the position of that little triangle of subdued reflection on the right hand cheek, And because I've got the watercolour, I'm going to be able to soften and almost obliterate the first one that I put down. So in other words, the one in the wrong place I'm going to be able to lose, hopefully so that it's completely invisible to the untrained eye. You know, if you hadn't seen me make that mistake, I'm hoping that in the final painting you wouldn't know that I did. So this is a fantastic way, I think, the watercolour marker with the damp, clean brush, a fantastically efficient and expressive way to work with watercolour, but in a really safe and controlled way. So if you're just starting out with watercolour, this is great fun. And this is something, it's a technique I use actually also when I'm out and about sketching outdoors. So you know, if I'm out at the beach and I don't want to carry with me a ton of equipment, then I'll just do a quick monochrome sketch of the scene. And all you need is this marker pen and a brush. You know, if you're out at the beach, you can just dip the brush in the sea and just move your paint around a bit, so, which is really good fun as well. So going back to talking about the hair and how to depict hair. So I said, well, initially you want to just think about the outline of this stuff as a collection. There are no individual hairs. Having done that, then you sort of think, well, okay, let's add some general tone there. And then after that, you just want to look for the large patches of light and the largest patches of shadow. Now, while you're putting those in, it makes sense, just like we were talking about with the folds of the clothes, it makes sense to have your mark making be in line with the direction the hair is falling. And you know, when you come to the outline like I'm doing here, you can add a few squiggles in here and there, like that little stray lock of hair just to the right of Noel's right cheek. But you know, don't get too tangled up in it. No pun intended. Just kind of keep things going in the same general direction. And then when you're happy with the modelling of the whole of the hair, at the end you can then add a few wispy bits of hair, or the odd curl or the odd lock of hair which has just gone a little bit astray. And that will be enough to capture the character of the hair without having to worry about trying to depict every single lock or hair on the person's head. But I've moved over to the right hand side of this top he's wearing, and again I'm putting in a couple of the broken hearts, just enough to indicate the patterning on the fabric. So you can see it's starting to take shape now. He's looking like, beginning to look like Noel, I hope. And again I come in with my clean wet brush. Now when I say wet, I've dipped it in my water pot, but I've got some paper towel nearby. So what I do is I dip it in the water pot. I just run the bristles of the brush over the paper towel a couple of times, just so that the brush is moist, but so that I'm not going to flood the drawing with water. And in the same way that right at the beginning of this video, I said the kind of illustration outline acted as a framework within which I could work. Well, it's the same with all the marks I've put down. So I mentioned that the marks I used for Noel's top, I kept those more or less in line with the folds of the fabric. So when I come back and use my brush, I can run my brush along those marks I've made, making adjustments as I go, obviously. And it's kind of a roadmap for me to follow. So that what will happen is, as I drag the bristles of the damp brush through those marks, then the brush strokes themselves will help to describe what I'm depicting. But some of the underlying original marks from the marker pen, they won't be completely destroyed, so they'll be there as well. So it adds kind of like a nice double layered effect to the mark making and the descriptions of tone and contours that you're putting down. But it's random enough that it seems natural and not overly considered. So you can see that now I'm working around the face and I'm using slightly smaller brush strokes now, moving the brush in a more controlled manner. But even here I'm being careful to move the brush in a direction which will be descriptive. So if I was shading this with pencil and I was doing the, for example, well, like I just did then, or up around the eye, you know, the little, or on the left cheek, that's perfect. I just kind of dragged the brush in a slight arc from right to left, because that helped to describe the curved surface of Noel's cheek. And again, there, that little brush above the eyebrow, going from top right slightly diagonally down to lower left, that helps to describe the fact that his forehead is curving away from us there on the left. Now onto the headband. And so what you can do is, having kind of blended some of the tone on the headband, if you've got some of that paint left on your brush, then areas of the marker drawing that you haven't tapped into already, they can act as little reservoirs of paint for you to spread around on other parts of the painting. Now that little triangle of light, I needed to remember that it was a subdued highlight. And you can see what I've done there is I actually decided to more or less obliterate both of the triangles that I put down. And the reason for that is I marked the area of that subdued highlight with a clear line of a triangle. But I felt that the outline of that triangle was too harsh and it was drawing too much attention to the highlight. So for now, I've got rid of that, and we'll come back and deal with that later. But on to the second colour, finally onto the second colour of this painting. So I'm coming in with some magenta. So I thought it would be nice to have a colour which really popped compared to the rather subdued burnt umber. And of course, this is reasonably in keeping with the colour of the hearts on Noel's top in real life anyway. And what I've done is I've just kind of scribbled down a few marks within each of the hearts, and I'm using the same clean wet brush technique to fill out those hearts. And then having done that, I can begin to add a little bit of warmth to Noel's face, because that magenta is going to be, okay to use as a suggestion of a flesh tone. But, I don't want to go overboard with this. So the idea, as mentioned earlier, is to do a monochrome study with a few carefully chosen, with two carefully chosen accent colours. Now the brush I'm using here, if you look closely, you can see that the bristles are somewhat frayed and separated into 3 or 4 little subsections across the width of the brush. And I'm quite happy for that, because it can create a more characterful line. So you get those 3 groups of bristles putting down a line each, quite a broad line, with gaps between each of the 3 broad lines, and then within each broad line there are little marks from each of the individual bristles. And it's just kind of a nice way, it's a nice way to make marks, I find. Alright, so now I'm coming in with some biro, or ballpoint pen if you prefer. So I'm using this to kind of just put in some really fine lines, and I'm also going to use it to put in a little bit of shading here and there as well. And again, the line you put down, because it's very different with the ballpoint pen compared to the watercolour marker and the brush, it just adds another layer of, it's a different quality of mark making, so it just makes for a more interesting image, I feel. Now, if you remember back to a few weeks ago with Bernadine's portrait, she had a pattern top, quite a complex pattern, and I was talking about how you can use the patterning on a top to help you really efficiently describe the folds in fabric. And I'm using a similar technique here for the quite tight folds and lines in the headband that Noel is wearing. So the headband actually has a pattern of dark stars on it. You can see I've taken a little bit of care to describe at least one of those fairly carefully. But in general, I'm just kind of using that pattern quite selectively. I'm not really copying the pattern as I see it on Noel's headband. What I'm doing is I'm thinking, okay, how can I position these stars to help me create the illusion of the fabric being bunched up in those tight creases? And the way I do that is to look and see where on Noel's headband there's just part of a star showing, where it's kind of peeking out from within a crease. Or maybe there's a star bending over a fold in the fabric, and I'll copy that shape. And then what I'll do is, as I said, rather than try and copy each and every star, I'll just put stars reasonably evenly distributed across the headband as I see fit, up until the point where I feel, well, that's enough to sort of convey the message that this headband is patterned, and it's helped me create a three-dimensional illusion as well. Now, Biro is absolutely fantastic for drawing. I really love it. I actually used Biro for the Akron portrait back in week 1, in a slightly different way to the way I'm using it here. But it's really cool because it will go on top of watercolor, no problem at all. And I feel it really adds quite a lot to watercolor in some cases. And you don't just have to use black. You could use blue or red. Obviously, there's a ton of different colors available in terms of ballpoint pen. Really cheap as well, really affordable. So that's really good. The main thing I would say is, if you're just starting out with drawing with Biro, you definitely want to have a piece of kitchen towel handy, or like I'm doing, I'm using my other hand just to wipe the nib off periodically, because they do tend to blot. And unless you want that kind of blotted line style, which I don't for this portrait, then you definitely want to be, on the ball when it comes to keeping the nib of the ballpoint pen nice and clean. So while I was chatting away there, I've been working on the eyebrow and Noel's eye as well. And I'm adding some hash lines, and also I'll be doing a bit of cross hatching as well. Sorry, I think I said hash, I meant hatch lines, and then cross hatching as well. Again, I'm being careful to keep the direction of those shading lines in line with the contours of the surfaces of Noel's face. I'm also making little corrections to the outline of his face and the nose as I go. So, my golden rule is that I will correct and correct and correct right up until the end of the painting if I have to, even if that means redrawing stuff, that I thought I got right at the beginning. So I think Noel has quite a quiet demeanour when he's just chatting, and there's often a sense of thoughtfulness behind his eyes, I think. And I hope that with this pose I'm using, it was a screenshot taken when he was mid-conversation actually, but he's looking off to his left, and his mouth is partly open, and I hope I've sort of captured something of the feeling that he's thinking about what he's saying or recalling a memory. So I'm being really quite delicate with the lines I'm putting down on the iris of each eye, and with the eyelashes, just being really careful. Again, I'm looking carefully at my reference all the time to see if I need to make corrections. And if I'm happy with the line that I've used, then I may just leave it as it is, as the burnt umber watercolor, or I may enhance it by going over it again with the ballpoint pen. And you can see I introduced a highlight into the left eye there. I didn't actually draw the highlight. What I did was I just put an extra line with the ballpoint pen to indicate the edge of the iris, but I didn't complete the iris. And so just having that line stop in that left-hand eye, it creates the illusion of a little spot of light. Now, one of the things I find I have to be quite careful of when I come to a region of deep shadow or relatively deep shadow with the biro is it can be quite tempting to just kind of scribble in there and put in a really dark block of dark tone. And that's certainly a quick way to do it. But in general, I find that it's better to take a more layered approach and gradually build up the layers of tone using hatching or cross-hatching. It just makes for a more interesting area of the painting. In general, you know, sometimes you can do like a really quick scribbly mark and it can have some real energy and power. And I'm all for that as well. But it's more, I think it's more about, it's not that there's a right or wrong, it's just more about being aware of the different choices we have and making a conscious decision as to what we want to do. Now, when it comes to the teeth and the slightly open mouth, then here, you know, I'm really just indicating the teeth. I'm not interested in depicting every single tooth. Although recently I did a portrait painting for, they mentioned on the show recently, they mentioned, I think it was the Claire Boulding episode actually, they mentioned the portraits for NHS heroes that has been going around recently on Instagram. Fantastic initiative by, I think it's Tom Croft, the Oxford artist. I'll double check the name. Apologies if I just got that wrong. And I took part in that. I painted a sister from a COVID-19 ward recently, and her husband asked me to paint her. The reference photo he gave me was a beaming smile, basically. So that meant I had to be quite careful to depict each tooth individually to get it to be convincing and capture some emotion. And I'll be putting that video up on the channel at some point. But in general, you know, portraits are typically, if you look at, you know, portraits throughout the years, throughout the centuries, it's pretty rare that people are painted with their mouths open. And when they are, the teeth are often just indicated with a sweep of the brush, you know, a single brush mark. So painting teeth is quite a rare thing to see, really. But it can make for a more interesting portrait, you know, because of that, just because it's a rarity. So working on the chin, the line that I've put down for the chin using the watercolour marker, that's more or less a U shape. But notice that the lines I put down with the biro on top of that, I'm keeping them, you know, roughly at 90 degrees to the line of the marker. And that's a good general tip, that if you've drawn a line to show the outline of something, then any sort of shading lines you put on, generally speaking, you want them to be at a different angle to the original line. So for example, if it was just a simple vertical line and that was the edge of a wall, then the shading lines might be horizontal, or they might be at a slight angle to the horizontal to indicate some perspective. Now when it comes to the hair, again, I'm adding some fine lines here and there, definitely not going to do it everywhere, but I'm keeping in mind, although I'm having a bit of fun doing the odd little wiggly line, you know, representing stray hairs coming off the edge, I'm still very much keeping in mind how the hair is behaving as a mass. So is the hair kind of bowing out towards us and then curving away? And if so, I'll use lines to help describe that. Now similarly, when I come to the headband, these little lines I'm putting in, they're more or less at 90 degrees to the general direction of the headband. The headband's basically going from left to right. So the little shading lines I put in just a second ago were more or less vertical. And we can define edges of objects really well using the ballpoint pen also. So we can, you know, add a certain character to the edge of a wash if we want to. So soft edges are very easy to achieve with watercolour, you know, because you can use the wet in wet approach, or in this case, just by simply letting the edge of the wash blend out into the paper. But the biro is a nice way to really pick up an edge or part of an edge of a wash if you want to highlight that or strengthen that. The burnt umber watercolour marker, you know, it puts down a pretty dark level of tone, especially if you put it down neat and quite thickly. But it's not as dark as, say, you know, if it was mixed with an ultramarine blue. So by putting the black biro on top, I can further strengthen the dark tones. And I'm just adding a few little touches of biro onto Noel's top, because I very much want the focus of this painting to be his face. So the level of detail on the face I'll keep higher than the level of detail on other areas of the painting. So we started off with our burnt umber and then added the magenta watercolour marker and then added the biro, and I'm going to add a further accent colour in just a second with the watercolour marker. But before I do that, I'm just putting in a few little indications of lines between the teeth, as mentioned earlier, not looking to depict them in a great level of detail, but just enough to indicate that they are teeth and it's not just a band of, you know, of white. And I feel that the kind of the quirkiness of the method I'm using to create this image hopefully matches reasonably well the quirkiness of Noel's personality and style. So it's just some gentle little lines here to add a little more expression or a little more structure around the nose and the eyes. Little furrows in the brow. And you can see, you know, what I'm creating here, it's almost got a vintage feel, but hopefully kind of a modern vintage feel. You know, the pops of colour and the use of the biro. Now this is a good little tip. What I want to do here is just add I'm using a turquoise watercolour marker here, and I want to add some of this colour to the irises of Noel's eyes, but I don't want to go in too heavy, so I don't want to risk using the marker straight onto my painting. So I'm just using a scrap bit of paper as my palette, and as you can see with a wet brush I've just rubbed that into the marker lines I put down, and that's allowed me to pick up just a little touch of that colour to add a subtle hint of turquoise to Noel's eyes. And that complements the magenta reasonably well, and so yeah, so they work. You know, it's quite a striking combination, I feel. And now I'm just going to add a little bit of that to the right hand side of the face, just to add an extra little dimension to the shadows, so we've got more than one colour going on. Again, I don't want to go over the top with this, just a few hints here and there. And I've just added a little touch onto his chest, just so that there's a little bit of the turquoise in all regions of the painting, really. And now, just to really up the contrast in certain areas, I'm just darkening with my burnt umber watercolour marker, the same thing I started out with. I quite like coming back to the very thing I started with, actually, sometimes with paintings. Quite often, actually, the more and more I think about it. There's a certain symmetry to the process that I quite like. And I've heard writers say that they start with a symbol or a theme in their stories or scripts, and then at the end they kind of echo that as well. But in this case it works well simply because, you know, most of the image is burnt umber, so I can come back in with the burnt umber to darken certain areas and make them stand out a little bit more. Now I'm using the same technique that I used earlier for the turquoise marker here. Put down a patch of the burnt umber onto the paper, and then I've picked some of that up with my damp brush just to add, you know, a little bit more of a deeper tone to that right hand cheek. And then that little triangle of subdued light, because I've covered that in turquoise now, hopefully that's going to stand out as a highlight, but it will be of an appropriate value. And I can use the same burnt umber, lift it off of my little palette there to darken other shadows around the right eye. Just did a bit under the nose before that. So it's always a good idea, even at this very late stage, to squint at either your sitter or your reference photo. And, you know, when we've been working a while on these fine lines with the biro, or these, you know, fun squiggles with the biro, or adding extra colours and things, it's easy to get lost in that. And it's always important, I feel, to come back and just look at the original reference and think, right, as a pattern of light and dark, is my final painting reasonably in keeping with that? Where are the big areas of shadow? Where are the largest areas of highlight? And let me just go back in and readjust things here and there to make sure that I haven't lost that fundamental structure. And what I'm doing here is just adding a couple of lines to break up the edge of that dark shadow next to Noel's face, so that it's not just too heavy a flat line. So there's a bit more of a subtle blending going from that shadow through to the rest of the hair. And these lines also, you know, add a little bit of surface texture to the hair as well. So there's a close-up of the eyes. You can see that little highlight on the left-hand eye works quite well from a distance. And there's the finished painting. Hope you enjoyed this video. As always, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of The Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.